Hello, everyone. I am Stephanie Raleigh, Department Head of Landscape Architecture and Regional and Community Planning, and I'd like to welcome you to the final Ekdahl Lecture of the semester, given by Brie Hensold. The Oscar S. Ekdahl Distinguished Lecture Series in the College of Architecture, Planning, and Design honors Oscar Ekdahl, who received his Bachelor of Architecture degree from Kansas State University in 1933. He was a founding partner in Ekdahl, Davis, Depew, Person Architects in Topeka. And we share this information at the beginning of each Ekdahl lecture to honor the person whose legacy has had such a deep and long-lasting impact on students, faculty, and professionals. The Ekdahl lectures are the finest individuals in the design and planning disciplines. Most importantly, these innovative and inspiring people help students visualize the work of each of our disciplines, and they inspire each of us to consider the impact our own work might have. City planning is central to the issues and concerns of our time. Planners shape the places and the systems that determine the quality of people's lives. We advocate for thoughtful development and redevelopment that optimizes resources, and we shape policies and plans that foster connectivity, inclusivity, equity, and sustainability. Planners shape the environment for today and for decades into the future. Brie Hensold is a planner whose work puts community empowerment at the forefront. Her firm, Agency Landscape and Planning, believes that diversity and inclusion are foundational to addressing the most challenging issues of contemporary society. The name of her firm lets you know that they value the agency of human beings to make change, and they work for and with agencies that create public spaces and places. Brie holds a Master of Urban Planning with an urban design concentration from the Harvard University Graduate School of Design and a Bachelor of Arts in Architectural Studies and Art History from Rice University. She remains engaged with Harvard, serving as a design critic at the Graduate School of Design and leading an executive education class in Resilient Cities. Brie's work has been honored by ASLA, AIA, and most certainly APA. Earlier this week, Brie was named an honorary member of the American Society of Landscape Architects. Honorary memberships are bestowed upon a very limited number of distinguished people. Brie was selected for the honor for her landscape-motivated practice and collaborations that utilize both legacy and emerging models of practice. In other words, she's a game changer. APDesign was introduced to Brie's practice 2.5 years ago. Doesn't seem like it was that long ago, when her co-founder, Gina Ford, gave an Ekdahl lecture less than 2 months after agency was formed. Gina shared their belief that planning can empower people and design is an act of optimism. And she told us about their vision for a practice founded on the power of people to initiate and make purposeful, positive change. So today we are so lucky because we get to have this wonderful opportunity to follow up and learn how agency took action on that vision. Brie is going to talk for about 45 minutes, sharing her work and her vision. We solicited questions from you during the last week, and at the end of Brie's lecture, Professor Leslie Wren will join her to share your questions and engage Brie in discussion. So if you haven't done so already, please get ready to put your questions in chat, and you can do that throughout the presentation. Professor Wren is going to moderate the chat, and then we'll share your questions with Brie at the end. So please join me in welcoming Brie Hensold to APDesign and Kansas State. We are so thrilled to have you with us today as an Ekdahl Lecture, Brie. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Shall I go ahead and share the screen?
Please do.
Wonderful. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I usually cringe during bios and introductions. They're so hard to listen to, but that was such a nice one. You really encapsulated so much of what we're trying to do and what agency values as a practice. So thank you so much for that introduction. I guess I'll jump right in so that we can get through a lot of projects and then have some time to discuss at the end. I'm so honored to be able to be here tonight, to be invited, and to get to share with you the kind of planning angle of agency landscape and planning, and really how our kind of landscape and planning synthesis really shapes urban planning in a different way, I think. I found it so helpful and energizing too to do these lectures, meet with students as I did earlier, landscape architecture students, and I know tomorrow I'll meet with some planning students. So I'm really looking forward to that. That's been such a nice moment to punctuate these pandemic days where we're all, I think, a little bit more remote and disconnected. So I really appreciate KSU setting up this opportunity for us all to connect. I think, we're here to talk today about the opportunity of design and planning to find optimism and to find action. But the reason that that's so important right now is because we are all managing a lot of challenges, right, as communities. And I think we are sitting in a moment where, as we would say in Boston, there is a wicked lot of change amidst us. And so whether that's the environmental change that we've seen raging increasingly through climate change, wildfires, coastal changes that we see here in Boston, demographic shifts that are really kind of change, and I think leading a lot of us to face some really difficult conversations, which move us forward, right? That change moves us forward, but we need to do that optimistically, or to think about kind of the cultural movements that are changing the role of women, Black communities, other communities that have often been underrepresented or had voices that aren't present and are now finding new ways to have a voice. So we're facing as communities, as a country, all of these changes. And we see that playing out in our practice as well. That was really foundational to the formation of agency, the ability to grapple with communities, help them navigate change, and as Stephanie said, make that change positive, make it purposeful. Sometimes we see that through the lens of communities that are recovering from disasters, like here in Jersey City, post-Sandy. Sometimes we see that through kind of the slow but very real changes, demographic change, that we as a country are becoming older, right, and need to meet the needs of older adults, becoming more diverse, more multicultural, and yet don't always have systems in place that can that access everyone equally. And we see that playing out in our streets, in our public realm, as we saw earlier this year through cultural change. This is Franklin Park in Boston, a historic Olmsted landscape where we're doing a master plan with Reed Hildebrand and Mass Design, an architecture firm here. And this was the moments, the week following George Floyd's death. And we saw the park take on a new kind of democratic movement, a place for expression, a place for gathering safely, even during a pandemic, and a really important place for community expression. So we at Agency really embrace that those movements drive our practice. They drive planning, they drive design. And as Stephanie said, we are 3 years young. And, I think if any of you find yourselves in the future starting your own firm, one of the hardest decisions you'll make is what to call yourselves. Nothing really feels right. And nothing felt right to us until we stumbled on the word agency, because it's really about the capacity of people to make change, to have action, and to do that within their environments. And we believe that that agency is really buoyed and supported and informed by both planning and design, and that planning has a really big role to remove barriers, historic barriers, physical barriers, social barriers, and that design itself is an optimistic act. So coupled with planning is really powerful, and that coupled with people, it's incredibly powerful to make that type of purposeful change. Stephanie introduced my business partner and my partner in crime, the design eye at agency, Gina Ford, and I know that she's giving a big virtual wave to all of you from Cambridge right now. I loved seeing the introductory video that you all sent with the travels that you do as a community of students, perhaps less so this year than you would like to, but it was really fun to see you walking along the Riverwalk, one of Gina's kind of seminal works in Chicago, and we loved seeing that, and I loved seeing you all working at your desks and kind of the productive nature of working remotely too. When we created agency, Gina and I were building on a couple of decades of practice together, this realization that planning plus landscape was a really powerful combination for shaping places, whether those are waterfronts, public spaces, particularly downtowns, working together on flood recovery projects like in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, you can see bottom left, thinking about activation of the public realm in a different way, about programming and the lens that planning can bring to built work projects around that, and thinking about cultural planning too. And I'll show you kind of a glimpse of all of this as we go through. But what was really important to us, and that is really a thread in our practice, is that I think each of those projects are really only exciting and can only kind of have wings and authenticity if they're told through the lens of the community. So we see each plan, each design opportunity as a chance to tell the story of place through the lens of people, whether that's a community that is thinking about the future of a new park or one that is grappling with flood recovery. All of those kind of elements, we want to hear the stories and we want to bring those forward. And we thought that in order to really do that, that we might have to, with agency, shake up the typical planning and design and build process, where you might see that a plan is often thought of as kind of something to do upstream, to seed capital improvements, to do that with kind of episodic engagement, reach a point where you take a break, funding has to happen, political will and alignment happens, planning goes quiet, and then eventually, projects will come out of that, that there was this kind of very linear process with engagement punctuating it along the way. And we saw the opportunity to think instead of those three elements as parallel streams that all have equal importance and that all at any moment within the design and planning process are present. So planning, landscape, and engagement all being in sync. And even more so than being in sync, perhaps being integrated. So we really see the opportunity of this that is integrating planning and landscape to address those kind of key issues that are driving change today. It's really only by understanding the big kind of climatic shifts and ecological systems at the root of it that you can get at resilience. It's really only through, digging into demographic patterns, as well as on the ground vitality and activation that you can get at cultural expression. So all of these elements that are really huge values for our work, longevity, sharing benefits, equity, we saw those as really needing to be tethered very much simultaneously at all scales of work to both planning and landscape architecture. And we've been really fortunate to, in the short life of agency, to get to work all over the country, kind of testing out that idea on really unique projects that bring together those two disciplines deeply connected to community engagement. And to create some great opportunities at all scales, from really small plazas up to regional river systems. And today I'm going to focus on those kind of bigger system scale projects and give you, tell you the stories of some of our plans through the lens of 4 different kind of planning categories: water systems, open space strategies, downtowns and neighborhoods, and institutional communities. And we'll start sort of at the biggest scale, perhaps, that of water systems, which is really core to our work. I would say that Gina and I both, since the very beginning, have been working on waterfronts, whether that's through her own design work or a lot of strategic planning that I do. And we see this operating kind of from coastal resilience plans to riverfront plans and strategies, all the way down to regional trails. And it's been really helpful to think you know, what are the key questions that we're asking as we take on these types of projects, these projects that grapple with linear water systems. And what we see is, you know, often the key question that comes up is how a linear corridor that really traverses a lot of geographies of difference, politically, development patterns, land uses, how can that one water system tie together a lot of different communities, places, and people with a coherent identity that also celebrates that difference? And I'll start sort of with the coastal resilience question. This is something that we've been working on, I think really came to the front of our practice around Hurricane Sandy, working with communities along the Jersey Shore. This is Asbury Park. And what we saw is actually that the coastline, of course, is our largest linear water system, right? Going all the way up the Atlantic seaboard or other kind of coasts, but this is where we were focused at that time. And it was really interesting to us working with ecologists, biologists at Rutgers. We saw that there was this kind of typology of that coastline, that it wasn't different everywhere, but there were these kind of repeating different types, the barrier islands, the headlands, and the inland bay, and that each had different types of vulnerabilities and different types of design and planning opportunities. So you can see we were working on the Jersey Shore over here on the right of the screen that embodied and had in different locations, all three of those different types. What we realized in the beginning to kind of zoom out is that if we could find design solutions, planning solutions for the Jersey Shore, those could be typically applied to other Sandy affected areas or to other areas that are vulnerable on the East Coast in the future. So as we were looking at, this is a barrier island condition along the Jersey Shore, as we were looking at the future kind of inundation potential, I think that this is 2030 projections, but from about 5 years ago, as we were looking at the kind of extreme vulnerability of barrier islands in the Jersey Shore, it told us a lot about how the country would need to grapple with the idea of retreat, of more diverse economies that didn't only rely on tourism, and that was a notion that would be something important for all water systems that are coastal and that have this type of inundation. We also do a lot of riverfront planning. I think it's one of my favorite things to do. There's something about a river that is such a strong identity to place, but often we see over and over again, so underutilized. And this is the White River in Indianapolis. It actually traverses throughout much of the state, but we focused on a regional plan for a stretch of it that was only 58 miles long. So, you know, 2 counties running through Indianapolis in Marion County and up into Hamilton County. So very different trajectory from a very urban center all the way out to more rural agricultural zones. And I think, you know, at all scales of planning, engagement is important, but it was really clear to us that for this regional plan for a shared water asset, that engagement was even more important perhaps to think about. And I know that a lot of you do engagement in your studios, in your field work, in other courses, and are thinking about that for the future as well. So I just wanted to kind of point out a couple of things that we learned through this process. One was that, you know, you can see the impact of kind of how the different ways that we reach people and the metrics or the kind of number of people that we reach through those different strategies, all the way from existing events down to this kind of strategy we had called River Guides, which was soliciting volunteers who were really, really passionate about the White River and wanted to be engaged in the planning process in a deeper way, wanted to be ambassadors to their community and wanted to be long-term engaged in the implementation of the project. And I think, you know, for everything that we did in between those two, the pop-ups at existing events that you see a lot on the right, down to this idea of kind of building stewards, everything in between was really important, but those two things probably made the most significant difference in terms of reaching a group very broadly through existing events and, you know, getting children engaged, as well as reaching people very deeply when they wanted to be reached in that way. And all of those conversations helped us get a sense of, you know, this 58-mile-long stretch of the river. It was not undifferentiated. It actually had a lot of different character zones. Each type of kind of community along it shaped the identity of the river in a different way, had a different way of relating to it, a different comfort level with access, public access or private property rights, different aspirations for civic engagement or conservation. And so all of those community discussions helped us land on this idea of 6 different reaches that could have different character areas and different approaches to how the river might be changed over time. Within that, we also identified what we called 10 anchors, and those became focused projects that could be catalytic as well as long-term, but projects that could really dig in and start to activate the river in a different way. So I'll show you just a couple of those, because up and down the river with all of that difference, they ranged wildly. This is downtown Indianapolis, a dam called Emmericksville Dam, and actually right in the middle of the process, this dam breached. And so we had the opportunity and the kind of need to really kind of get out ahead of the rebuilding of this dam as purely power and water infrastructure, and instead to think about it as more multifunctional infrastructure, right? I think we're at this moment where we can no longer think about any of our infrastructure as single function, but instead need to layer on recreation, access, ecological systems. And so we helped to imagine how that could instead be converted to something that was passable through recreation, something that could allow fish to traverse up and down and have sort of a healthier life cycle, something that might have a kind of different relationship to access to the neighborhoods, revitalizing neighborhood parks and restoring a historic beach that had once been there in the community memory. So all of these ideas that we learned through engagement, we were able to seize a moment that happened in the middle of the project and help the community imagine how that change could happen. At the other end of that spectrum, right, we had that kind of really civic move in the middle of Indianapolis. At the other end of the spectrum, we also had very early on a lot of concern expressed from generational farmers in the north in Hamilton County who heard about a riverfront plan and imagined that what it meant was takings, easements, people coming onto their property from the water. And so we worked really closely with them and actually invited those who were the biggest dissenters onto the steering committee to join us, be part of the negotiations, the discussions, and to come up with a plan that would allow them to maintain their land, have security in that, and imagine how the public could still use the waterway and kind of bypass, for the time being, some of those key areas that gave them worry. So throughout that kind of 58-mile-long process, we didn't have really, in a way, we had one plan that tied it all together, but we had a lot of smaller plans that responded to unique and individual needs. And then I just want to close out this section as we're looking at the water systems with a look at the Highline Canal. And I said regional trails, right? And when we think trails, I think we don't immediately think water. But what's been so interesting in all of my work on trail systems is that they have such a relationship to water. And oftentimes we see the trails develop in the places where private development, where built development doesn't happen, right? So they're happening along streams, they're happening in the floodways, they're happening in relationship to water. And that's just sort of a something that's developed slowly over time. And then communities are trying to find ways to kind of knit that network together and make more sense of it. And that's where planners can come in. This is the Highline Canal in Denver, and it's actually sort of the reverse of that. Rather than being in the low-lying area, the Highline, just as it sounds, follows the high line of topography over 71 miles in Denver, and that's because it was originally, like many pieces of infrastructure, it was originally an irrigation channel for agriculture. And so it's this sort of incredible element of history and sort of something that people have a lot of attachment to that has now turned, as Denver has developed in a totally different way, into much more of a recreational amenity, really not being used or very much in a limited way for water anymore. Instead, it's much more about this kind of really unique recreational trail that still traverses that high line of topography and stitches together a really wide range of communities. And so in the same way, again, for a regional system like this that meets so many different people, engagement became really critically important. And then that helped us develop a series of preliminary kind of what we were calling concepts, but you could also call these principles that looked at the canal through a variety of lenses: natural, connected, varied, managed in a new way that might re-engage water, and enhanced in a way that could attract more people and become more of an amenity. And on the planning side, we really dug into access and equity. And you can see here, I'll just sort of walk you through these diagrams. On the left, imagining that this is the southern tip of the canal, then the northern tip of the canal, which was right by the airport in Denver. So what we tried to map was how our amenities and how our environmental conditions distributed as it relates to demographics. Demographics like population density, where people are, where poverty is highest, and where kind of underserved communities are as well. And so you can see here a few just places, and this will again point to a lot of typical conditions across cities in our country, that we have these couple of interstates, right? And adjacent to them, we see higher levels of poverty, and we also see much lower levels of access. That's what this dotted line here is: access points into the canal, which is the recreational trail system. So you have people living in lower income places, and they don't have access to this amenity that is meant to be a public amenity to meet the needs of the community. Again, you can see here lower provision of kind of playgrounds, other amenities, and even a little bit here we take a dip in terms of tree canopy. So really pointing out through a lot of data analysis and looking at data in different ways where those gaps were and where those missing pieces were. And we also looked at that kind of at a mapped canal-wide level. So here on the left, you're looking at connectivity and trying to understand where there are gaps today. There have been places where the recreational trail component hasn't been able to be connected. And so this project was very much about trying to figure out, how do you create a bypass, or how do you make a connection that's missing today so it can be continuous as a trail, or identifying places where quality was a real issue. It wasn't just about making that connection, but making one that was safe. And that was traversable for, somebody learning to ride a bike or somebody going for a run, and not a threat due to kind of vehicular collisions or other issues. We also looked at stormwater, and as we said, with that managed kind of principle of re-engaging stormwater, both in terms of water quality and just sort of a benefit to users into the river by thinking of or into the canal by thinking of more of a watershed approach. So you can see here one of the focus areas that we dug into was a place where there was a gap as it went through kind of this tricky intersection. And what I like so much about this is that you can see this kind of really unusual trail that emerged that really cuts right through kind of the development patterns on either side. You don't often see that kind of knitting together, and that's because it was the high line, right? It was the high topography line, so it just followed that. But ultimately, all of those kind of planning principles, data analysis was meant to arrive at the idea of kind of creating a more equitable, more accessible, better experience of the canal in the future. So those are the kind of look at water systems. And now I'm going to move over to what I'm calling open space strategies. We do at agency a lot of parks and recreation system planning. So that's looking at a whole city or a county, sometimes a region, and looking at both recreational programs and open space amenities and open spaces themselves, and trying to understand how those line up with the community today and the community in the future. And we're also doing work within the kind of productive landscape world. So I'll show you a little bit of both of those. Here, what we're seeing, especially within parks and recreation, that there's this increasing focus on equity in public health, but it's always a balance. It's always a balance of growth and conservation, community need, and kind of social gathering, partnerships and funding, and the real need for capital improvements, and then public health and recreation and programming. So this is a project that we're completing right now in Mecklenburg County, which is the county surrounding Charlotte, North Carolina, a place that is growing tremendously. This is actually one of their greenways, one of their kind of trail systems that follows the linear streams or waterways throughout the whole county. And in Charlotte, it was really interesting because open space is used, accessed, and able to be provided so differently from the urban center of uptown Charlotte out to the perimeter of the county, which is really kind of natural, less developed. And then in the middle, we have these local hubs, this sort of more suburban area that's where growth is happening the fastest, but also where there's less of a clear development pattern, and where we see more of that suburban pattern of development that makes accessibility, connectivity, access much harder. And so a lot of the metrics that we use to measure success in terms of parks and open space, walkability to certain amenities, it really falls apart in those local hubs. And so we had to think differently about those places because land values are going up, making acquisition more difficult. Partnerships are becoming much more important. But this was a place where really looking and digging into the development patterns helped us understand what the opportunities were for open space. And the other piece of the puzzle was understanding growth and quality. Part of the project was doing an on-the-ground inventory of all of the parks and recreation facilities across the county, which was a lot, but we got to know everything really well. And what we saw is that in general, the large regional parks were performing really well, but there was this pattern of older neighborhood parks within the kind of urban core in the center. They're the parks you can see with the orange circle around them that were just scoring really low in terms of maintenance and amenities. And also that was corresponding to what we were calling priority community, denser, more children, more non-white residents. So places that, you know, really needed investment for a lot of reasons, for use, for access, and had clearly not seen that type of investment in recent plans in recent decades. We also had to balance that with these areas that I talked about that are kind of the dashed lines, the areas of new growth. And so kind of through that understanding, and we've seen this all across the country, these sort of neglected older historic parks that are nested within denser areas, the county has really made a commitment that its #1 priority is committing to equity in its investments. And so we've been working with them to think about how do they use data to do that in a way that is equitable, tangible, and sort of incontrovertible, right? That can't let politics enter in. And I'm going to spend a little more time talking about this project, which is about kind of productive landscapes. And this is in Detroit. It's called Detroit Land-Based Ventures, which I always liked because it's this idea that people have entrepreneurism and opportunity through land. But we know in Detroit, land is a really kind of fraught question, right? That they actually have an abundance of land and a really sort of complicated economic structure because of that. In about 2014, they did an inventory and realized that they had citywide 40,000 sites, residential sites that had vacant homes on them that had been completely abandoned and were at risk of kind of, you know, contributing to challenges within the neighborhood. And so they went through a process of really, with the city in partnership with the land bank, of taking on those properties, demolishing them, and trying to get them into more productive use. So you can see even on this map, this is only 11,000 of those properties. Imagine multiplying that by 4, right? And one of the ways that they put the land into productive use was trying to get it in the hands of neighbors, right? Imagining that people would maybe want to adopt a side lot, and they would have these auctions where you could do that for $100, adopt the lot next to you. And so that started to initiate this re-engagement and reactivation of a lot of land throughout the city for various ventures. So that might be a scaled up farming in the upper left. It might be public art, smaller rain gardens and stormwater infrastructure, or larger scale solar infrastructure that also contributed to a broader neighborhood. But in putting that in place, they also realized that they put land into the hands of residents to use in residential neighborhoods for non-residential uses, right? And did that without totally knowing what the end result would be. And so we came in a few years later, together with Asakura Robinson, another really great planning and design firm, and worked with them to kind of untangle the processes that they had now to get land into neighbors' hands, as well as think about design initiatives that might help, you know, what you might call incompatible land uses be better neighbors to the residences that they were next to. So we were asking questions about how do you have a community art project coexist within a residential neighborhood? How do you think about the, you know, privacy or protection needs of a farm and actually create more of a friendly edge to neighbors? So all of these questions came up, and also working with the process itself, which was really esoteric. You might have been able to get a side lot, purchase it for $100, but then you needed to employ a lawyer, right, to help you get through the permitting process and the deed process. So we held public meetings where you can see on the bottom left here, every red sticky is a community identified challenge in the process today, and only a couple of the moments, I guess, in green where it's going well. But it helped us understand a lot kind of where the process could be simplified, and also where more tools could be put in place to help the community go through this kind of needed permitting process to make everything, all the ownership legal and all the next steps and changes of use legal as well. And one of those tools that was deemed needed was what came to be known as good neighbor guidelines. And that gets a little bit at that compatibility question, helping people, creating these guides that kind of took the zoning and pulled out everything that might be relevant to urban agriculture, which was 90% of the projects that we were looking at, and making it really straightforward, accessible, showing people how to draw a simple plot plan so that they could do the work themselves without having to pay experts. And you can see here really kind of going through the zoning where urban agriculture is not technically a land use, but pulling out everything that might be relevant to governing it and putting it right in front of these users as though it were just a chapter of the zoning document itself. The third type of planning project I want to talk about are institutional communities. And I really love working with these types of partners because they operate sort of in parallel and partnership with public entities, but you know, with a really different type of mission. So that might be government partners, national or local, or arts and culture. And here we often see, I think the other part that's really fun about working with institutions is that they're very mission driven. And so we're often thinking about history, and we're often thinking about how do we create a future that is really true to their original mission and true to the past. So blending those things together, thinking as well about organizational needs, operations, interpretation, and experience. And one of the places right here that you see is the Charlestown Navy Yard in Boston. This is a National Park Service site. It's about a 30-acre site that is home to the USS Constitution and the Cassin Young, which is in the background there. It's a World War II ship, and the National Parks of Boston leader affectionately calls this site, or maybe not affectionately, two ships in a parking lot. Because while it is probably one of the most profoundly important places to visit along the Freedom Trail for sort of understanding American history and accessing that, there's really very minimal visitor amenities, very little visitor experience. It's sort of thought of as an afterthought to security and to the kind of infrastructure of place. And they were also coming at it at a moment where the National Park Service, like everything that we've talked about, realized that change is happening, right? Change is happening in the country, and that the kind of incredible parks that we often think of when we think of the National Park Service, Yellowstone here or others out west, weren't meeting the needs of where our country is growing, right? And that the National Park Service also had these urban amenities like the Charlestown Navy Yard that could serve a different purpose and start to meet people where they are. And so we did a visitor experience plan that let us dig into the site, reimagine how it could become more comfortable and more hospitable to those visitors from all countries, all backgrounds, all awareness of kind of the civics that were being communicated here, but also to kind of break down the walls of this site as a museum and welcome in the community, welcome in the dog walkers, welcome in the kids living next door in Charlestown, and really think of this as a great community park as well. And digging deeper into the arts and culture piece, I want to talk a little bit about the Chinati Foundation, which is in Marfa, Texas. I don't know, I wish I could see faces. I would ask how many people have been there or how many people know about it. But the Chinati Foundation is a really incredible resource, and Marfa is a very special place in far west Texas. It's located in the Trans-Pecos region, which is in the high desert. So a really incredible landscape to drive through and access. It's sort of a pilgrimage to reach it because it's about 3 or 4 hours from any airport. And it's a place that is really associated, Chinati, with Donald Judd. And Donald Judd, for those who don't know, is an artist working in the 70s and 80s who found Marfa, who found this region of Texas and decided that he wanted to create a museum unlike others in New York and where a lot of the art scene was growing up, and to create this museum that was very anchored to place, where everything was permanently installed and very much tied to architecture and landscape as well as the art itself. And he had discovered this place when he was in the Army, much younger, I guess this is in the 40s, nice town, beautiful country mountains. So it's a really prescient moment to see that, 30 years later, he would relocate to Marfa and kind of create this arts community that would grow and change so much through his influence. The other thing, I think we often think of Donald Judd, of Chinati, and for those who know it, think of the aluminum boxes or think of some of his artwork, think of these incredible architectural spaces. But Donald Judd was also a really politically motivated artist, very steeped in the culture of place. And so part of Chinati's mission is also tied to the rural ranching communities that attracted him there and tied to sort of the traditions of West Texas. And when I came there to do a master plan, it was because they were at this moment where visitor attendance was increasing dramatically. You can see here, even from 2010 to 2015, it had increased threefold. And they were expecting, if it continued, it could be at 50,000 by today. I'm sure with the pandemic, they've had a little bit of a break, but they were feeling this pressure to kind of re-entrench, to understand how to shepherd and steward their buildings, their land in a different way. They had a really clear sense of art conservation, but not so much of the environment and the place. And so we took them through an alternatives process, really asked this question of who do you want to be? How does your mission meet place here? And said you could be option one, you could just kind of heal the moments that are in need of reinvestment and maintenance. And there's a lot of properties across the site that had significant deferred maintenance. And so they could really just kind of tinker and heal in place. Or option two, they could really expand their mission in line with some of Donald Judd's mission towards the landscape, towards engagement with the landscape in a different way, and kind of total interpretation of the full site, which they don't do yet today, as well as kind of acknowledging that Marfa, so this is the town of Marfa, or city of Marfa, this is the Chinati Institute's land, 300 acres, so you can see the kind of relationship there, acknowledging that a lot of the tourism that they had initially driven and had kind of now taken on a life of its own was shifting the center of gravity downtown, and so they could re-entrench and really highlight and invest in their downtown properties as well. Or on the kind of third option, they could build on Judd's idea as a kind of politically motivated artist, as a community maker, and really start to invest maybe a little bit less in their property and more in these kind of civic amenities, a stream that ran through the Chinati property and then connected over to the high school and into town. So creating this kind of regional trail, really see themselves as community makers. And it was interesting because they had such a clear mission of Donald Judd's vision for the place and for the art, but hadn't yet thought about any of those questions about how do we shepherd the architecture, how do we shepherd the land, how do we shepherd our relationship with the community. So ultimately they landed on sort of that second option, right? The one where they really expand their initiative and interpretation on site and then connect in smaller ways to those downtown sites. And this is the Chinati Foundation today, where I would encourage all of you to go someday. It's really an incredible place. And these are some of the ideas that we help them kind of hone in on for their key steps in the future. How to reinterpret the use of the property, how to reinforce their downtown presence. And this was sort of a real shift in mindset, how to steward the landscape. I think there was a sense that leaving the land alone was stewarding it, but instead they had a lot of invasive species, they had a lot of bare ground and damage from construction projects, and they didn't realize that in the same way that they continuously conserve the art, they also needed to take care of the land. And so we work with them on really simple key steps to do that, reimagining how you might take care of some of these places and come back to some of what had originally attracted Judd to this location. I'm just going to close on one final section, which is perhaps what we often think of, I think, most when we think of planning community plans and downtown plans. And this takes us back to that original question we started with too. How can planning and design be tools to help people evolve, to help communities evolve, to meet changing needs and to use change as a tool for good? We often see that there's a real tension between population growth and change, affordability and sense of place, partnerships and expansion and kind of programming that is feels community-based, and mobility and the public realm. And a little shout out to some teammates who I saw on this meeting, if they're still there, David Dowell and Sean Slattery, who are from El Dorado, just east of you all in Kansas City, a wonderful architectural urban design firm that is leading a project, and we're working with them in Portland, Oregon for a neighborhood plan, the Albina Community Investment Plan, and sharing some of their way of interpreting kind of the question and the charge of this project, which is something I know that you all think a lot about already from the preview questions I've seen, but how do we heal some of the damage done by past urban planning decisions, urban renewal in particular. You can see on the left the change from the 50s to today, where we went from kind of what was the heart of Black Portland in Northeast Portland to what is now kind of large parking lots and entertainment venues and a highway that segments this district from the still vibrant Northeast neighborhoods. So the question we have is, what does the future look like? But then also, how do we achieve that? And this is their great visualization of how a planning process could be remarkably different, could take on not only kind of economics and market demand, but a real initiative around wealth building and wealth creation that stays with a particular community, and how history and art and storytelling can weave through at every step too. So I would say stay tuned and watch out for that one. And then I'll just close with the Downtown Bozeman Improvement Plan. This is, I think, in many ways a quintessential downtown plan. This is one of my favorite places in the world, downtown Bozeman. And I think that oftentimes downtown plans are really driven by development. It's a huge voice at the table, but we really try to also bring in the history of place when it comes to the landscape perspective, the stories of other communities. Downtown Bozeman really grew up as a crossroads in the West. It evolved, as an agricultural hub, and that's when the downtown got its kind of civic heart. And then today we're seeing this retrenching around tourism and kind of lifestyle growth. So it's a pattern where I think this, it's important to start from history before we look forward. But if we do look forward, we see a lot of pressures that demanded this plan, that the place is growing and expanding in a way that is really uncomfortable for many and is really challenging affordability and quality of life. And the downtown is experiencing a lot of change, but also change that I think a lot of places across the country are feeling. The Main Street had once been a place where people had beloved local businesses, and now it's really challenged around the kind of retail challenges that we're seeing through the online retail, as well as just increasing rents. Here we tried to really embed ourselves in place, and because it's really not painful at all to spend time in the summer in Bozeman, we went out there and we spent a couple weeks just sort of immersed, doing a lot of pop-ups, a lot of engagement, a lot of drop-ins, and really spending time from start to finish in community charrettes. And what the community helped us understand was there were kind of 5 key ideas to guide their future, the future of the downtown, and then it had to achieve all of these 5 goals. And I'll just walk through a few of the ideas. One is that, oftentimes I think in the past we thought of downtowns as competing with other districts, right? Like you wanted to harness all growth, all investment in the downtown and make downtown thrive. And that's a really good strategy. But now downtown is super successful. And so we kind of had to shift that and say, well, downtown is part of an ecosystem, and the success of downtown is tied to the success of all these other districts, and they can work together. And we shouldn't think of downtown as just this one place where we concentrate everything. You can see the downtown today, and we help them kind of chart out future development and really think about what that might look like. You can see the historic Main Street fairly unchanged, but all of this pressure around the edges and pressure at the edges that are right adjacent to neighborhoods. So you can imagine the kind of tension that created. With that understanding too, that growth was going to happen off of Main Street. It took us away from the idea of downtown as this linear Main Street and towards the idea that we could focus on these kind of perpendicular corridors and give them a sense of place, really renew those corridors as districts unto themselves. And we imagined kind of building on some of the public realm assets, like a buried creek that connected into a beloved downtown park, to really give new development a sense of place in combination with public realm improvements. And getting off of Main Street also meant engaging the alleys in a different way. This is, your typical alley, these kind of amazing connections that exist behind Main Street and the backs of businesses, and thinking about how that could be a simple activation project. A lot of conversations about housing and how affordability really needed to be tied to supply and to diversity of housing. I think this is probably one of the hardest topics on the table for the city as a whole today. Or maybe that's parking, but one of those two, right? That parking in downtown could bring everything to a halt, kind of debates around that. And so working to think about parking in a much more management-oriented way, less about supply actually in this case, that they had capacity, but it was about management and other non-vehicular options. And thinking too about, as we talked about that kind of retail apocalypse that was forecast, and that is a challenge for Bozeman as well, thinking about how you could have active ground floors without always needing to rely on retail or restaurants. And so I hope I left us some time for discussion, but that was a walk through agencies' work kind of across water systems, open space, neighborhoods, and institutions. And I'm very much looking forward to thoughts and questions. Should I stop sharing, Leslie?
You can stop sharing for just a second as I navigate both of us into view. Thank you so much, Brie. Let me see here. I'm sorry, my Zoom screen is moving around on me. There we go. Let's see. If I do this, no, we are not shared. Share both of us. Oh, thank you. Great. Well, Brie, thank you so much for opening a window into so many interesting, amazing projects. You're right. It does make me feel much more optimistic to be in these professions that deal with how we manage and develop our lands and our public spaces. Thank you for that.
It's very helpful.
And I'm going to jump into some questions
right
now because we have some good ones. So I'm going to start with one that Stephanie posed in the chat, and it will be very relevant to the students who are watching right now, many of whom are in production mode or about to be. And she said that your highline diagrams are wonderful. And can you tell us about your approach, your thinking about visual communication?
Yeah, I think it's so important. I'm glad that those resonated. Those are by a wonderful planner in our office, Rhiannon Sinclair. And I think, in that particular case, it was very much about how do we layer data to tell a story and to visualize that story so that it wasn't just about, I think we could have mapped that information and showed something similar, but we really wanted to show and highlight difference across the corridor. And so we thought, let's dig into something that's in a way closer to a chart or a graph in that case. Let's get out of the map. Sometimes I feel like in planning, we overly rely on maps, right? And you can have a whole presentation that's just map after map after map. And I always want to get out of one perspective, right? And look, maybe sometimes it's an aspatial diagram, like this one had that spatial component just of the line from north to south, and everything else was treating it like a chart, or getting into a section or some other way to understand place. So I think that's a big part of our process is variety, right? Tell a story through multiple different lenses and show it to people in different ways to reinforce that story, as well as tying data into visuals. I think data is such a powerful tool that we can use, to look at first, what is it saying, and then highlight. I think, if you can squint at it and see what is the big idea, what is the takeaway, then that's a successful visual communication. So hopefully those did that.
Love it. Getting to another part of your process, I'm going to pick up a question that was submitted by Lee Scabland. He was curious about how you contact and convene stakeholders who are involved in your projects.
Yeah, so I think, and this is something Stephanie mentioned at the beginning that I teach as well, and I teach in a studio setting at the GSD to second semester urban planning students who are engaging for the first time in engagement. And we talk a lot about the need to have and kind of seek out trust brokers in the community, people who already are leaders but represent a broader group. And I think especially for a national practice like us, who's often going into a new community without those relationships, we really rely on people who are already trusted and have kind of a network. And one example of that is Franklin Park, which I only showed at the very beginning in the Black Lives Matter march that went through Franklin Park. But at the beginning of that project, it's a really significant landscape in Boston, and it's south of downtown. Boston is one of the most kind of economically and racially segregated cities in the country. There have been a lot of press about that in recent years, putting a spotlight on that, which is really great. But this park sits kind of nestled between, it kind of has two sides, right? Black community and Latinx community and white community on the east. And that's really kind of generalizing, but you can see that in the data. And we saw that, disproportionately our participation was that Eastern Jamaica Plain neighborhood side, and we weren't hearing representatively from the community. And so we had a survey up, and we had one person who's a representative from a neighborhood who's a representative of Dorchester neighborhood, and he posted it, and we got about 4,000 people to participate and completely turn the table. And so I think, you know, asking for that help is really important. And also what we try to do too is to look at those metrics and continually, you know, normalize them against demographics and understand, are we being inclusive? Are we missing communities, and are there ways to kind of like engage with businesses or other people who can connect us? So both kind of quantitative measurement and then just trust and stakeholder relationships.
Excellent.
But
Yeah.
it's a lot of time. It's a big part of what planners do.
But it's how you get your best data, right? It's how
It
you
is, yeah, and the
this
stories,
information.
right? Yeah, it's how you make place.
So we have a couple questions from Edson and David, and I'm going to
Okay.
switch the order on them as we scale from working with people to working with political groups. So I'm going to ask David's first.
Mm-hmm.
He comments that your work is so much about place, being where people are.
Yeah.
How has the pandemic affected your process? And has it taught you anything new about how you engage people while you have to stay at home?
Oh, it's so hard. Yeah. And David is at El Dorado, who we're working with in Portland. So it's been really hard to start that project and not be able to fly out to Portland, both be on the ground physically and on the ground in the community. So in that case, I would say that we have had to kind of talk less and listen more and rely on avenues of, again, the kind of people in the community to explain to us kind of what's the pulse on the ground, what's going on. And in a case where normally I think one of planners' strongest skills is facilitation and kind of really helping people through that discussion, I would say that we've been more passive in that, maybe in this case, but in an intentional way to do more listening because we aren't there and we recognize that. And so we're relying on this kind of shift. And it's been interesting to see, I think, you know, sometimes you can facilitate actively and sometimes you can facilitate passively and still get stories and kind of get a conversation going. So that's one shift that I think I'll take away. Other insights of staying home while we work. You know, I think we've also kind of strengthened our partnerships with clients on that front. And the Mecklenburg County project that I showed was about at 50% through when COVID sort of really came in March and kind of changed our project trajectory. And so through that, we've had to really kind of reframe again the engagement part of it. We were lucky to have done all the on the ground inventory and have a good sense of place, but we've had to have a really different approach to online engagement and also relying on our clients and our local partners to get out there in the parks and to tell us what's happening there.
Thank you. So I'm going to go back now to Edson's question. And the question is, at what stage of your design and planning projects with communities do you reach out and involve local governing authorities for approval?
As early as possible, I would say. You know, I think we often do kind of at the beginning a fact finding or a taking the temperature moment, and when we can get an audience with the authorities, let them know that this is happening. We'll do that as soon as possible. There's also, you know, thinking of kind of the planning process where we go through analysis and then early concepts, later concepts, and recommendations. I would say that there's another point too where we're moving from the early concepts to the recommendations that we often circle back. On Mecklenburg County right now, we're in the process of kind of orchestrating that part at the end too, when we do go for approvals at the end, but hopefully built on bringing those governing authorities through the stages of the plan with us. It's really hard to do a plan without a committee that kind of has representatives that can tie back to the desires and the priorities of the decision makers. And so oftentimes that's the way that we do it too. And in those cases, it can be more that we just go at the end for the approval because we've had these representatives who help steer us along the way.
Thank you. I'm going to combine a question from Edward with one of the ones that was submitted previously.
Okay.
So Edward is asking,
Mhm.
what are the differences in your working experiences with the range of clients that you deal with? So, you know, urban centers, smaller town, rural clients. He's asking who gets more engaged as a client. So I'm going to just pause that, and then I will also piggyback onto it a question about, have you had the opportunity to find ways to build meaningful bridges between urban and rural communities that always have to pivot on suburbia or not? So answer that as you see fit.
Yeah, the kind of urban-rural tie in both of those. Well, I think the White River project that I showed, that is that 58-mile long riverfront vision around Indianapolis, is a place that, due to the vision of the client really and their kind of organization, I think it did a really good job of bringing together the rural concerns and the kind of priorities of downtown Indianapolis and the neighborhoods around downtown as well. And, I tried to highlight in those two examples of that really civic activation of the dam, very public intervention, meant to be community-based public land, versus in Hamilton County to the north, where there was much more concern about property rights and sort of the more development, that we could also kind of find ways to balance those things. I think, it's hard to say who gets more engaged as a client, but I also think of Marfa, which is a really small community, about 2,500 people in rural West Texas. And that when we had public meetings there about, the decisions of a private museum, we still had public meetings about it. It was an extraordinarily passionate group who felt a lot of ownership and attachment for this private museum. So I think, it's hard to say who gets more engaged as a client. I think they both are. And on the urban-rural question, do you always have to pivot and hinge on the suburban thing? I would say no. Definitely Marfa is one of those places where you're coming in from kind of ranch land with no development, and you suddenly turn a corner and you're at like the stoplight of the downtown, and so there is no kind of transect or transition there. And it's a really interesting relationship to land and kind of conservation ethos that they have that kind of drives and protects that. And so it's been really fascinating to work in those places too.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question.
We have a question from Sarah Hadavi, and she is observing that the projects that you discussed demonstrate great collaboration between planning and landscape architecture and communities. And if you could say something to those who are interested in interdisciplinary firms after they graduate, what would you want to say about that kind of work?
Yeah, I mean, it's what I've always done. I think there was a question too that was in one of the ones that was submitted early that was asking about my background, which is architecture and then urban planning, but also having studied policy early on too. I think I knew very early on when I was studying architecture that I needed that interdisciplinary access and connection. And so that's why I sort of piled on those additional studies. And I feel like I seek that too in projects and in firms. And so I think for those who are interested in joining, I would say, know that and be willing and be enthusiastic about learning from people who bring a really different angle and different perspective. I love working with Gina. We started this firm together because we have really different training and skills, but also a different lens, attitude. We joke about it a lot too. She's very extroverted. I'm quieter. I need to take my time to think about things. And so I think that balance is really valuable, both in terms of disciplines, but also just people who think differently from you. So I would say seek that out. Do more of the listening, less of the talking, like we were talking about with the COVID engagement too. And also know that what I love about working on interdisciplinary teams is that I have really learned the value of planning And so you'll really learn the value of your skills and what you bring and what your training is, and how other people will value it too, because they're bringing something different. So that's the joy of it.
Amber, I'm going to get to your question in just a second. Here's another question. As we saw with the recent election, I know it hasn't been that long, so I'm not asking you for political commentary, but people will voice their opinion when it's easier for them to do so.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if, in the few days it's been since we've had our election, how do you think this kind of ease in voter participation is potentially going to create changes in planning and other design professions?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question. We've been starting to play with, and I think planning in general has, both in terms of how municipal governments do work, and then also how we in the private sector try to stage engagement processes, playing with kind of mimicking some processes that are more about enfranchisement and decision-making around funding. So I'm thinking of participatory budgeting and trying to layer that in. It's actually something that we're trying to think about, can we even do that at agency within our internal decision-making structure? But I think it's a really helpful tool for planners as they engage with community members. People need to know that they're participating in something, whether it's voting or a plan that will have impact and have meaning. And that's, nothing does that like money, right? And allocating funds. And so thinking about where there are places where planning can give more of that agency, give more of that power and decision-making to communities. I think we talk a lot about, though, the flip side is the consensus building side, which isn't about voting and isn't about just kind of asking people for interest, right? But instead is about getting people to understand others' perspectives. So I hope that, that greater participation will also be about greater listening to those that you disagree with initially, or that, you continue to disagree with, but can respect positions around. So I think that's where the promise is.
Awesome. We have a great question from an architecture student, Amber Pryor, and she observes that they don't really address equity and community engagement when they're working on projects that are privately funded or private spaces. And she is curious, how can students or even practitioners think about equity and community engagement when they're working on private projects?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, that's a little bit of kind of the thinking that, with the downtown plan, so much of places, especially urban centers, are shaped by private development, right? And even the parks and recreation plans that we do now, a lot of kind of, I think what's going to be important in the future is how do these agencies work with private development to to negotiate around greater investment from the private sector into the public sector. So I think there's a need for the private sector to have that perspective. Stephanie mentioned in the beginning too that I teach an executive education course, and what's fun about that is that it's primarily taught to people in the real estate side of the world, which has a really different kind of set of priorities than the public sector, right? So it's a chance to kind of bring those two together and get that group thinking about kind of what feels like second nature to the public sector. And I think vice versa too. I learn a tremendous amount from kind of what placemaking looks like to the real estate world and the private sector. So I think, it's hard as a student to feel like you're doing engagement. I know this from my students a lot because the semester is so short. There's so many constraints. You can't really deeply engage or embed. But I know that there's a lot of efforts made to do that. And I think, it's really hard to feel like it's ever enough in engagement, to know where to stop. And so know that no matter how small the contribution feels, it's kind of starting to crack open a conversation, and that's still meaningful. I think that's what I would say most, is that more engagement is needed between private and public sectors, so they shouldn't be such separate things, and then every little bit matters.
Thank you. I'm going to close
Okay.
with one last question. And thank you for, answering these questions and this
Oh, it's so fun. Yeah, thank you. Thanks to
insight
everyone.
is great. Okay. This is one of the ones submitted ahead of time. It's the year 2050.
Mm-hmm.
The children of today's APD students are starting their undergraduate studies, hopefully as designers, but really whatever they want to do is fine. But if they are in a design or planning program, how will they be talking about planning and planners mid-century in terms of how they have shaped the 21st century of the United States and beyond our borders?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the questions that you all submitted earlier were so great because I put them to my team to see. They were such good questions. I wanted to know what the rest of the team thought too. And, there were some, I think, combination of hopes and aspirations there too. I think we're in a little bit of that first slide that I showed that kind of dramatizes a little bit the climate change, cultural change, demographic change that we're feeling right now. I think and really hope that in 2050, we are really head on working within the realm of climate change and have been for decades, right? That maybe we get serious about that sooner, and that planning is very closely engaged with that. I hope too that that this idea of kind of natural systems and landscape and interdisciplinarity is much more natural and really is sort of the norm rather than something that we talk about seeking out, right? It's something that happens and performs. I think this question too of participation. I hope that by 2050, the planners of 2050 are have much better ways to reach more inclusively communities. That was one of the things that happened in COVID. We had a chance to really recalibrate engagement, and it was not heartbreaking to leave behind some of the traditional public meetings that we had relied on for so long, because in many ways they're not effective. They're not effective in reaching a lot of people and reaching people broadly and equitably. And so I hope that that's sort of, again, more of a norm than these kind of routines that we use because they're built into our systems, but they're not performing for us in the way that we need to. So that's my hopes. We have some truths around kind of environmental commitments, and we have a baseline of engagement that is really natural.
Yes. Thank you so much, Brie. Okay, so everybody, APD, we can give Brie Hensold a round of applause through our favorite medium, Zoom, on the chat box. But thank you so much for joining us for this Ekdahl Lecture. It's so great to have practitioners come and be able to speak to us about what you're doing, what you see going on for the future. What you see is what we need to be thinking about here in College of AP Design.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And it's been wonderful to see work of students along the way too. And to have all these questions. I love hearing what's on everyone's minds, and very excited for the future of all the designers and planners in this Zoom room. So thank you so much for listening and for engaging.